Joe Keller reads the newspaper in his backyard on a Sunday morning in August, soon after the end of World War II. The stage is set to represent the backyard of a two-story house with garden chairs, flanked by poplar trees. His neighbors, Dr. Jim Bayliss and Frank Luby, drop by. The men engage in small talk about tobacco, the want ads and movies. They observe that a strong wind the night before blew down an apple tree that the Keller family planted in honor of their son, Larry, who has been missing in action for 3 years. Frank reveals that he has agreed to figure out Larry's horoscope to determine whether November 25th, the day Larry disappeared, was a fortunate day astrologically. If it was, it might mean that Larry is still alive, an illusion to which Joe's wife, Kate, still clings. The Kellers' other son, Chris, has invited Ann Deaver to their home. They picked her up at the train station the night before. Ann once lived next door to the Kellers, but moved away 3 years ago. Sue Bayliss arrives to tell her husband, Jim, about a patient's phone call. Lydia Luby arrives to tell her husband, Frank, that the toaster isn't working. Chris appears and joins the conversation too, choosing the book section of the newspaper. A boy from the neighborhood, Bert, enters and converses with Joe. They play an ongoing game in which Bert is a cop and Joe is his boss, and they pretend there is a jail in the Keller's basement. Bert tells Joe that another boy, Tommy, says a bad word, but won't reveal what it is, and then Bert exits. Chris tells Joe that he saw Kate in the yard during the storm in the middle of the night. He explains that at 4 in the morning he looked out the window and saw the tree crack in the wind, and he saw Kate run inside to the kitchen, crying loudly. Joe and Chris discuss Kate's unwillingness to accept Larry's death and admit that they enable her denial. Joe blames her refusal to accept the truth on the newspaper stories about men who occasionally show up after years of being missing. Chris wants to be honest with Kate, but Joe claims that there's no proof of Larry's death, citing that there's no body and no grave. When Chris tells Joe that he intends to marry Ann, Joe questions Chris's judgment. Chris even suggests that he would leave town and the business that he will inherit to build a family with Ann, who was formerly Larry's girl. Chris confesses that he feels like a sucker who is tired of being a good son and always trying to please others. When Joe states that he can't believe that Chris would move away, Chris challenges Joe to then help him stay by supporting his choices, marrying Ann, and finally admitting to himself and to Kate that Larry is not coming home. Joe's wife, Kate, referred to as Mother, enters the yard. She tells Joe that he has mistaken a bag of potatoes for garbage and asks for them back. She has a headache. Kate has convinced herself that Ann is also still hoping for Larry's return and admires that she remains faithful to him. Kate admits that she had a vision of Larry flying over their house when the tree fell. She heard his voice and saw his face. She claims that they planted the tree prematurely. When Chris leaves to get Kate an aspirin, she tells Joe that she suspects that Chris wants to marry Ann. She reveals that if Larry's not coming back, she'll kill herself. When Chris tells his mother that it's time they accept Larry's death, she changes the subject to going out to dinner. When Bert rushes in and mentions the jail that he and Joe pretend is in the Keller's basement, Kate reacts angrily and demands that both Bert and Joe stop pretending. When Ann joins them in the yard, she meets Jim Bayliss, who now lives in the house in which she grew up. They talk about going out to dinner. Ann is staying in Larry's old room, which still holds his clothes and recently shined shoes. When Kate asks Ann if she's been dating, Ann confesses that she no longer waits for Larry's return, which enrages Kate. Kate explains that she would know if her son were dead. Ann also meets Frank, who inquires about her imprisoned father, Steve, but Ann reveals that she no longer communicates with her father. Joe recollects the day that he returned home, freed from prison, to rejuvenate his business. Ann recalls that her family were called murderers by the neighbors. The dialogue here reveals that Anne's father, Steve, and Joe owned a factory that manufactured aircraft parts. The men knowingly shipped faulty engines to the Air Force that caused the deaths of 21 pilots. For this crime, Steve went to prison, but Joe was found innocent and returned to work and his family. Anne wonders if the faulty engines could have caused Larry's death, a possibility that Joe refutes. Kate retreats into the house. Joe says that while Steve made a mistake, he doesn't consider him a murderer, adding that Larry never flew a P-40 aircraft, so the connection is impossible. Joe explains that Steve was in the cell next to his when they learned about Larry, and that he heard Steve cry for half the night. The group quickly changes the subject and continues discussing their planned night on the town. Later, alone in the yard with Chris, Anne accepts his proposal of marriage. They kiss several times. They have remained in contact through a series of letters, but they have not declared their love until now. Chris confides that during the war he led a company of soldiers, most of whom didn't survive. His guilt over their deaths contributes to his confusion about the war and his family's role in it. At the end of the act, Anne receives a phone call from her brother, George. He's flown in from New York to visit Steve in prison, and now George wants to see her. He will arrive soon. While Anne is on the phone, Joe confides his fear that the courts might reopen the case. He tells Chris that he wants to build them a stone house to make a clean start. He wants to rename the business Christopher Keller Incorporated. He wonders aloud if Chris is ashamed of the money he's made. Chris exits. When Kate tells Joe to be smart when George arrives, he reacts angrily and slams the screen door. It begins with Chris sawing off the broken part of the apple tree, leaving only the stump. Kate has prepared some grape juice for George, remembering that it was his favorite when he was young. While Joe naps, Kate tells Chris that Steve must hate Joe. When Anne appears on the porch, Kate goes inside. Chris tells Anne that they will tell Kate about their wedding plans that very night. And then he goes inside too, leaving Anne alone. Sue appears, looking for her husband, Jim. She and Anne discuss marriage, particularly about the need for financial security. Sue advises Anne to leave town after she and Chris marry, to start fresh somewhere else. She also reveals that Jim feels belittled and insecure by Chris's success. Chris makes Jim long to be a researcher, his true passion. Sue even accuses Chris of stealing from the manufacturing plant, a judgment Anne immediately resents and refutes. Sue tells Anne that everyone in the neighborhood knows the truth about Joe and Steve and calls Chris's idealism phony. When Sue exits and Chris appears, Anne shares their conversation about Joe. Chris makes it clear that he has never suspected that his father was guilty of the crime. He believes that Joe was falsely accused. Joe enters his yard, and with Anne and Chris, he looks forward to a celebratory evening ahead, in which he agrees they will share the wedding plans with Kate. Joe tells Anne that he would like her to offer that he set George up in their town to get him out of New York. He also wants to extend the invitation for Steve to work at the plant when he is paroled, a suggestion that Chris quickly dismisses as inappropriate. Suddenly, Lydia appears from next door, intending to fix Kate's hair for the big evening out, and Joe invents a ditty about combing my Katie's hair. Jim, who had left earlier to pick up George at the train station, now enters alone and pulls Joe aside. Jim advises Joe that Chris should talk to George somewhere other than in the Keller house because he has blood in his eyes. And Kate won't be able to handle what he has to say. An observation that confirms Joe's earlier fears. Jim also confides that George has come to take Anne home. Being a doctor, Jim has told George that Anne isn't well, but Chris disagrees. When George finally appears, Chris welcomes him with a friendly handshake. Anne observes that George's shirt is filthy as George looks at what used to be his house next door. When Sue appears and asks Jim if he wants to go to the beach, Chris introduces George to the couple. Sue and Jim invite George to see what they've done to the house, but George curtly replies that he prefers to remember it just the way it was, signaling an insistence on the reality of the past. George seems touched that Kate remembered that he liked grape juice. George and Chris talk about Chris's position at the plant and George's work as a lawyer, work with which he is disillusioned. When Anne remarks on George's hat, he says that he got it from Steve, which leads to a discussion of Steve's condition. George says that Steve has grown little and then angrily tells Anne that she cannot marry Chris. George confesses to Anne that they have treated Steve terribly. He goes on to explain that Steve told him exactly what happened on the day that the aircraft engines were shipped. He explained that Steve tried to get Joe to come into the plant that day, but Joe claimed that he was sick with the flu. On a phone call, Joe promised to take responsibility for the shipment, but that is not what happened later. George claims that Steve was too insecure to make such a big decision on his own, and that Joe was the one in charge who oversaw every detail of the plant. When George heard the truth from Steve's mouth, he realized that they all had been living a lie. George wants to talk to Joe directly and confront him with the truth, but Anne begs him not to do it immediately and spoil a fun evening. Kate appears, happy to see George, but instantly comments on how he has aged and how he looks like a ghost. She wants to feed him, offers him juice, and suggests that they cook at home instead of going out. George wants to leave for the 8:30 train, but Kate wants him to stay for dinner. Lydia appears, thrilled to see George. They were once romantically involved, and they reminisce a bit. Lydia exits to check with her husband Frank about Larry's horoscope. Kate tells George that he should have stayed out of the war and married Lydia, but that she has another prospect for him now. Chris remarks that this new prospect isn't very good-looking. Joe reappears and shakes hands with George. George says that he will be returning to New York and asks Joe about what products his plant manufactures now. When Joe asks about Steve, George explains that he's not well at all because of his soul. When Joe tells George that his father will always have a job at the plant, George responds that Steve hates your guts, Joe, and wishes harm to anyone who made money on the war. Joe says that Steve never knew how to own his actions and recalls a time when Steve left a heater on at the plant that nearly caused an accident. Joe recalls another time that Steve loaned money to someone who invested it poorly and blamed Steve for the poor investment, even calling him a swindler. Kate joins them and repeats her wish for George to stay for dinner. Anne offers him a clean shirt and tie. When George tells Joe and Kate that they haven't changed a bit, Joe replies that he doesn't have time to get sick. Kate injects that Joe hasn't been sick in 15 years, a slip of the tongue that Joe quickly tries to refute by reminding her of his flu during the war. When George questions Kate's memory, Joe immediately claims that he could not have gone into the plant that fateful day, but the damage has been done. George realizes the lie and calls Joe out on it. Just then, Frank appears to tell Kate that the horoscope reveals that Larry might be alive since November 25th was a fortunate day. When Chris calls the notion insane, Kate asks why it couldn't be possible. When George hears this, he surmises that Kate wants Anne to leave because she will not approve the marriage and has yet to accept that Larry is dead. A driver for Anne has arrived and honks the horn, but Chris insists that no one can tell Anne to leave. George reiterates that Kate has admitted that Joe has never been sick, a clear admission of his guilt. Kate has already packed Anne's bag. Anne follows George up the driveway. Chris confronts Kate, who admits that Anne doesn't belong here. Chris threatens to leave and speaks the truth, that Larry is dead. When Joe agrees with his son, Kate slaps Joe across the face and yells that she will never let Larry go. In a moment of fury, Kate admits that she cannot let Larry go because she knows the truth about Joe's role in the calamity. Chris is dumbfounded, suddenly and immediately realizing that Joe has lied and has murdered 21 pilots. Joe claims that he never killed anyone, but Chris holds him responsible nonetheless. Joe tries to defend himself by claiming that he did it all for his family, for Chris. He claims that he never thought the engines would be installed and that by the time he realized what happened, it was too late. Chris explodes in fury at his father, calling him less than an animal, pounding on his father's shoulder as the act ends in violence and disbelief. In the early morning hours of the following day, Kate sits on the porch alone, staring at the moon. Jim returns from a house call and tells Kate that he's always known Joe was guilty. Chris has driven away, alone. Jim tells Kate that Chris does not have the talent to live with this kind of truth, but that unlike Larry, Chris will return. When Joe appears, Kate tells him that he should turn himself in, which enrages Joe. He is also upset that Jim is inserting himself into his family. Again, Joe defends himself by claiming that his actions were justified by profits and family. Kate explains that for Chris, integrity is bigger than family, an idea that Joe can't understand. Joe insists he'll kill himself if there's something bigger than family. He also says that Larry would have not acted like this, and that Larry understood money better than Chris does. Anne appears and tries to convince Kate to be honest with Chris about Larry, freeing the two of them to marry. Kate refuses, they argue, and Joe goes back into the house at Anne's request. Anne has a letter from Larry that she hadn't wanted to share, but she now feels that Kate has left her no choice. Chris appears and apologizes to Anne for being a coward and for trusting Joe. Chris announces that he'll go to Cleveland to start a new life. He will not put his own father in jail, but he can no longer tolerate being in Joe's presence. Joe reappears, on the defensive. Chris admits that he feels so angry that he could do Joe physical harm. Joe yells at Chris to throw the family money away if he thinks it's dirty, and claims that what he did for the business was commonplace, that many men profited from the war. Chris agrees, but admits that he blindly revered Joe. The climax of the entire play is the moment when Anne shares Larry's letter, and the horrible truth of it, with the rest of his family. In the letter, Larry confesses that he will commit suicide in response to his father's crime. He read about Joe and Steve being convicted in a U.S. newspaper. Everyone listening becomes distraught. Joe quietly says that he finally understands and will turn himself in. He goes back inside. Kate asks Chris to let things go, but Chris refuses. He sees a bigger picture and believes that they all need to accept consequences and be better people. Suddenly, a gunshot explodes inside the house. Joe has killed himself. Kate tells Chris that it's not his fault, that he should go on living, and the curtain falls.